started. Again, welcome to this week's office hours for ESG and ESGCV. My name is Kimberly and I am today's moderator. If you are just joining us, please go to the chat and introduce yourself with your name and the reason you represent. As a reminder, this office hours session is being recorded for public record. A copy of the slide deck and recording will be emailed to all attendees. Next slide, please. How to ask a question. All questions must be submitted in the chat box. Please type your question into the chat box. The team will read questions out loud at the end of the presentation and will provide answers if possible throughout the presentation. All questions and answers entered into the chat box will be recorded as part of the public record. Alongside our presenters, we also have several HCD staff, including ESG representatives, ESG-CV grant administrators, and other consultants who are able to answer questions during the Q&A session. Next slide, please. Today's office hours agenda includes the following: ESG, ESG-CV updates, office hour updates, upcoming trainings, ESG, ESG-CV Q&A, and our Spotlight Series presentation, Housing Problem Solving Policy. Next slide, please. These are your ESG policy documents. The policy documents are also on the ESG webpage under the Resource tab. Next slide, please. Please reach out to your ESG representatives listed above if you have any questions, or you can contact them at esgnofa@hcd.ca.gov. Next slide, please. ESG-CV updates. California received approximately $3.8 million in reallocated ESG-CV funding. HCD management is currently looking at options for distribution. ESG-CV budget revision workbook has been revised. Your ESG-CV grantees were emailed the most recent version of the budget revision workbook. If you did not receive that workbook, please reach out to your ESG-CV representative so you can get that. And it is also posted on the ESG webpage under the Forms tab. Next slide, please. Upcoming office hour topics: October 12th, Match Clinic office hours. October 19th, Shared Housing. October 26th, Youth Homelessness. And November 5th, Coordinated Entry System. Someone is going to drop the link into the chat for you to register for office hours. There is a, if you have not already registered, you will need to re-register for office hours. Next slide, please. And someone is also going to drop the link into the chat to register for our upcoming trainings that we have. Next slide, please. These are links for our COVID response resources. Next slide. Here are links for the monkeypox resources. Next slide. And these are links for the ESG resources. Again, these links will be sent out to you all along with the presentation and the recording. Next slide. Do we have any questions? Next slide, please. And if you do have any questions, please contact your annual ESG representative, or you can reach them at esgnofa hcd.gov. And for ESG-CV, please reach out to your grant administrator. Next slide, please. And now I will hand it over to Erica Snyder and Gordon Levine for today's Spotlight series presentation on shared housing problem-solving policy.
Great, thanks so much, Kimberly. We're really focusing more on housing problem solving, but don't worry, we will be talking about shared housing in 2 weeks. If you could pop ahead to the next slide, that'd be great. So I'm Erica Snyder. I'm a consultant working with ICF in California. I've been on a couple of these before, so maybe my face is familiar. The glasses are new though. And on our next slide, we're going to start kind of getting into this mindset for what goes into housing problem solving. I'm going to lay the foundation for the work, and then Gordon's going to take you deeper on some policy aspects. Next slide, please. So before I dive into talking about this, I'd like to have us all think, or if you could reflect on a time where you faced a really challenging situation to you. It was something that was very important. You didn't feel like you had a lot of autonomy or control over how things were going to go. And it was something that was a bit more persistent. It was ongoing. So this could be a personal loss. It could be a lot of different pressures at work. It could be a variety of things. But within that headspace, knowing all of these pressures were coming down on you, if you could just try to take a moment to remember how you act or felt. And so the slides will be up in just a minute, but that really is trying to connect us all to recognizing the role of stress and how that actually, it's been studied from neurologists that stress impacts the way our brain moves and our brain functions. It's something that can inhibit our reactions. It could cause a more stronger reaction. It also can numb out your emotions. It also impacts your short-term memory. And so it makes things a little bit more fuzzy. It can make it harder to make connections between details, to remember things that happened recently, to retrieve important information. And so these are all things that hopefully we all recognize are impacting folks who are currently unhoused or afraid they're about to lose their housing. And so we really want to think about, like, for us in a service industry that's really working with folks who are in these critical situations. If you could pop to the next slide, Taylor, that'd be great. But thinking for all of us in terms of our services, how might the homeless service system interactions that we have with folks either reduce or escalate their stress overload? You know, being asked to have all the right paperwork or all the right things in a moment when you're having a hard time thinking about where you're going to get your next meal or where you're going to sleep tonight might be challenging. So as we move ahead to our next slide, that thinking about how housing problem solving, really the genesis of it is to spark new ideas. And so we'll go ahead one more and just also like setting a landscape that I believe like all of us in this field are coming from a place of wanting to empower the individuals that we're working with to end their own homelessness, to help them tap into their natural strengths, to identify their resources, and just recognizing that because someone's experiencing homelessness doesn't make it a condition. It doesn't make it something that they have to have happen to them for the rest of their lives. It's truly a situation. And we're working to get them connected again, back to whatever their supports are that they need for long-term stability, for their long-term health and interaction and wellness. We know here that for those of us in California, which most of us are, that there are going to be more people who need some form of housing assistance than we have that capacity to provide. And housing problem solving gives us a set of strategies to work with folks to either keep them stably housed or to quickly resolve their housing crisis. And we also, I think we can acknowledge that we are not going to end homelessness in our state with just the 1 bedrooms or studios alone. It takes some more creativity in how we're going to address this. And that ultimately housing someone isn't a one-size-fits-all approach, that some folks need more support, some folks need less supports. And so we get to be flexible and adjust those dials based off of what someone tells us they need. Next slide, please. So when I'm talking about housing problem solving, for some folks, this might be a refresher. For other folks, perhaps this is a newer concept to you. But there are really a variety of strategies. It's a practice that can be used for strengths-based conversations to work with households, to help them tap into, like I said, their strengths, who are their networks, what are the community resources that are going to help them find the right housing situation for themselves. I think one thing I particularly enjoy about housing problem solving is it really takes the onus off of the person in the more of the quote unquote professional role, or the person working for an organization. And it really makes it so we're empowering the individual across from us to take back their autonomy and figure out what's best for them. We're just really coaches and guides and along the route, on the road with them on that. And so these are strategies that can be used in any homeless service program. It's not a standalone program. This is meant to be a way to have conversations and engage with folks. And also it's something that can be happening at any time. It may happen more than once. So the first time you talk with someone, they may not be able to fully engage in that conversation. So we introduce it again later on, and maybe in slightly different ways, different questions, different circumstances, life changes. And it's really about engaging in how do we help resolve your crises now to get you housed or to keep you housed. Next slide, please. You'll see in front of you here some of the core principles of going on with that. You've heard me talk about empowering, and I can't stress that enough, that this is a place where we're really empowering that individual who's experienced this housing crisis so they can begin to regain that sense of control over their situation and lives, and ultimately get control over situations in their lives. It's very much client-centered, and knowing that I, as Erica, don't know what you as Kristen may need, that you know for yourself what's best, and just creating space for you to tap into that and to identify what that would look like. And we all know that homelessness is a crisis. We acknowledge that it is hard when you are in crisis to think through and perhaps to connect some dots. And it can be hard to advocate for yourself, to recognize what's happening and interpret different situations. And so we in this field are there to walk alongside folks and assist where we need to, and empower and provide that feedback along the way. It's about listening and validating experiences in a way that's non-judgmental, because again, what's right for me may not be right for you, and vice versa. And that housing problem-solving strategies, like I mentioned before, it may not happen perfectly at first, but it could. There could be a conversation that helps light bulbs go off and resolves it. But it's something that I would encourage you, don't give up on the strategy if it doesn't work the first time. Keep using that, and happen throughout the entire time you're working with a person or a household. And then this really goes together with whatever work you're doing in using progressive engagement, and then ultimately getting folks connected to their own community supports, whatever that looks like, because no one person or entity is going to fully solve someone else's housing crisis. We're really wanting to make sure folks have the community that they need to continue to maintain and stabilize their housing. Next slide, please. When we're talking about housing problem solving, you've heard me mention it's a conversation, and perhaps some of you have either taken courses, or just maybe you're naturally going into conversations looking for problem solving, and that's essentially what that is. It might just be honing it in certain directions, reinforcing that, but the goal of every conversation within this is to identify the household's strengths, and if they're having a hard time identifying their own strengths, sharing that back to them. I think sometimes we all as individuals, especially when we're going through hard times, it can be hard to see what we're doing well and to see what's going right. And having someone else speak back what they're seeing in you can be very powerful. And also within those strengths, helping folks think broadly about who are their support networks. Have they been a part of a faith community? Do they have previous coworkers, friends, or families that they can tap into? Are there other agencies or organizations that they've been involved with in the past? Have they volunteered somewhere? Just helping to think creatively beyond just what's right in front of them right now. And then within that, exploring the right housing options for them. And this might be something that is let's say someone's calling and saying they're afraid they're going to lose their housing tonight. What's a safe place you can stay this evening or for a couple of days? It might be a temporary reprieve to give them some space to think about a longer term solution, but that is the goal. And really the objective is saying, we don't believe anyone should have to experience homelessness. Let's work with you to identify places to help keep you safe and find the right housing solutions be that short term and then ultimately long term. And that long term connection comes back to working with that household to find the right community supports and services for themselves. And that could be additionally like medical supports and services. That could be maybe they need to be closer to public transportation because they don't have a reliable vehicle to get them to and from work. Maybe they need to be closer to different grocery stores or friends or family, or away from a neighborhood that they have some really negative traumatic events that happened, etc. So next slide, please. And when I'm talking about having these housing problem solving, you'll see I call it HPS on some slides. I think a lot of these conversation like pointers here are going to be things that y'all have seen in different aspects of interacting with folks. That first and foremost is being mindful of the meeting environment. If you're in person, even if you're on Zoom, like what's on screen behind you, what's around you, what is it subtly conveying, or maybe folks could misinterpret. If it's in person, just being aware of that power dynamic. Coming to somebody needing help and assistance or asking for that is a very vulnerable place to be. So what are ways that you can position yourself in seating so that it's coming across as more of a conversation that's two-way and not somebody in power and someone coming in need? Also, just being mindful of your own body language and what that looks like. We have so many experts who are like interpreting body language. You'll see that for like celebrity on the red carpet, like, oh, this is what this person's body language meant. I think we are all looking for unconscious cues of what's going on with someone, what they're not saying, but they might convey with their body. So keeping your arms probably a bit open, avoiding like the cross, that can be comfortable. I do that sometimes, but that can also show that you're closed off. And so just being mindful of how you're sitting and how you're engaged. Also, if your body looks like you're actually listening and engaged. I know when we're tired, it can be hard to monitor that, but it's just important to keep that in mind. And when we're listening and engaging in conversation, the big thing I would stress is listening to understand, not listening to respond. I think a lot of us might have been in situations where we're talking with someone and sharing things, and you could just tell that they're waiting to give their thoughts or their opinions or to like move the conversation along, and they're not truly listening to understand what you're saying. And so this is all about the person in front of us, because the great thing about housing problem solving, and maybe a little uncomfortable if you like a script, is like there's no checklist, there's no script. It's about having creative conversations, learning more about a person, helping them tap into things. And so that just involves being engaged and hearing all the way through and asking different questions along the way. Also being clear and transparent in your conversation. My big thing too is to like not promise things that can't be, or to making sure that we're just using language that's accessible to folks, avoiding the acronym soup that is so common in our field and in most fields, and just having a regular conversation with someone. I've already talked about listening without judgment, but that comes through here. And that does also connect with normalizing the experiences and validating what you can. And I would say here, connect this back to the body language. Sometimes folks nod quite frequently to be like, yes, I'm listening, or I'm part of this conversation. But if we nod a lot, sometimes we inadvertently nod on things that might be looking like we're co-signing on like unhealthy or harmful behavior. And so it's important to be mindful when you're nodding along. And like, even if it's to say like, yes, I hear you, it could get interpreted by someone else as like, yes, I agree with you. And so just keep those pieces in mind. And then lastly, but not at all, like this is thread throughout, it's about exploring folks' strengths and resources. I know like one housing problem solving a colleague of mine had, an individual was afraid they were going to lose their housing. The root of that was that they were at risk of losing their job because they weren't able to get to work reliably. And the solution ended up being getting them a bicycle because they could bike to and from work. They had the physical capacity, it was close enough, they were able to do that. That bicycle resolved their homeless and housing crisis, but it wasn't necessarily the first thing someone would ask is like, oh, do you have some way to get to work? It just took listening, hearing the root causes that were triggering this current crisis, and then thinking creatively together about potential solutions. Next slide, please. And so in front of you, you'll just see a few of ways that we could start to shift our mindset and our conversations, shake it up from doing business as usual. So when someone presents saying that they need shelter or that they need a bed or somewhere to sleep tonight, instead of just asking like, are you willing to enter shelter? Are you willing to take a hotel motel voucher? reframing it to say like, so what do you think we could do to help you from becoming homeless tonight? And explore, and maybe they'll say nothing. When folks are in crisis, they might have a really strong emotional response. So it could take a couple of conversations, or not even conversations, just a couple different ways of asking the question. But instead of automatically assuming anyone coming to us for assistance is automatically going to get enrolled in homeless services, let's pause and see what are other resources that could be available to them. And then instead of like when someone's coming in, or even within that, before you start an assessment, like let's walk through and figure out what program you could best be a best fit for. Let's have a brainstorming conversation first about like the types or potential housing situations that could work for you, resources that you could use now or you've used in the past. There might be a way to get it resolved there before they get enrolled in rapid rehousing, before they get enrolled somewhere else. And then maybe you're working with folks, and I know that this is common in a lot of communities right now because it's hard out there to find housing, and they've been looking for a while. And so instead of saying like, let's reevaluate your search criteria, maybe we need to move to this zip code, maybe you need to do this, that, or the other. First ask about their housing options. Where are they having the most support? Who is their support? Because situations can change rapidly. Friends and family, coworkers, folks can come back into people's lives. Bridges can be rebuilt. The community connection could happen. And maybe within that too, connecting it back to the shared housing that we briefly talked about, maybe there's a roommate they want to live with. There's somebody that they would want to live in community with. Great, that's a different solution that we could resolve that opens up new opportunities. So those are just some examples, but I'm sure if you have more of things that you think about shifting mindset, encourage you to throw that in the chat. Next slide, please. These are some system-wide impacts that you could have. I'm not going to camp out on this slide, but what I will just say is like, this can get integrated into any community, any continuum of care. It's any program. It can be a part of your coordinated entry process to really help you when it comes to determining how to best use your resources for the most vulnerable. And it can be a part of diversion or rapid exits or interventions. And that ultimately to know that housing problem solving is a part of progressive engagement. It's used in that response. And so it's just refining it. These are things too, like housing problem solving is not a checklist. It's not its own standalone program. It's a part of anything that you're already doing. Next slide. So when that comes to staffing, luckily, in some ways, you get to be creative. There's not a one size fits all approach. There's not certain folks who should do it and certain folks who shouldn't. Like if you're going to talk with clients, highly encourage you to refine and hone your housing problem solving skills. These are things that folks who are hired right now can do. Existing staff, you could have dedicated staff if you decide that's what your community needs or what your program needs throughout your continuum of care. There are different things. You may need to do different trainings. I think one thing that's really helpful is role-playing conversations. It can feel awkward and uncomfortable, but it helps in making different connections and tapping into that creativity to getting those feedback. It's always great to have a network of peers and colleagues who are just helping to keep each other sharp in this place and in this field. And also just know that there's different roles it can look like. So I put a couple on the screen in front of you. It's not inclusive. It's not exhaustive of every possible solution, but your outreach workers, your coordinated entry staff can do this, case managers, diversion specialists, housing navigators, whoever. Next slide, please. So some key takeaways, as again, this is a very short primer on it. You can go much deeper in this, but just know that housing problem solving is for everyone. It can be a part and should be a part of your coordinated entry process, just to make sure we're working with our most vulnerable and helping folks get connected to already existing supports. It can be a part of any program that you want. And it's because at the heart of it is all about housing is our solution to solving homelessness for this individual, whether it's keeping their housing, helping them find new housing, whatever that may be. And that housing problem solving is really in line with all of the work around equity, reducing trauma, and supporting community efforts to end homelessness. But it's not a scripted conversation. It's not business as usual. It's not just triaging somebody into a program and not taking the time to kind of think creatively or have conversations with them. It's not just something that you fund individually or a one-time conversation. And then also I want to stress housing problem solving does not mean it's up to a case manager or an intake specialist to solve everything. It takes that pressure off the person in that role to try to be the super person to solve it all, and really starts to help folks take back that agency to do their own problem solving and creativity in addressing their needs. So I've just got one more slide with some key takeaways, which is on the next slide to really think through. It summarizes a lot of what we said about tapping into strengths, resources, and successes for that individual, maybe speaking that back to folks if it's hard for them to identify it themselves. It's about creating support and trust and making sure folks know we want them to succeed, collaborating with that individual on their strengths and their knowledge and their capabilities to resolve their current crisis, because they've probably been able to solve previous crises. So let's pull that forward. And then for all of us, being willing to lean into that conversation again if it didn't work the first time. So my next slide just has a few resources, which when you get access to the slides that you're going to be able to click on and kind of poke around. But I'd just like to take a minute to throw it over to Gordon to keep talking about housing problem solving.
All right, thanks very much, Erica. Housing problem solving is my very favorite topic, and so I'm really excited to engage with you all today. I'm also excited to hear about housing problem solving from another professional who's clearly deeply engaged with it. So I'm excited to talk with y'all about what I'm going to call the incoming housing problem solving policy from California HCD. This is a gesture at what we expect to be coming down. So don't take it as absolutely this is coming next week or it'll look exactly like this, but you can expect a housing problem solving policy, and you can expect it to include the elements that we're going to talk about today. Next slide, please. So as I said, there is an HPS policy coming soon. It will probably include, broadly speaking, the following elements. It will define housing problem solving as containing 4 core elements: case management, conflict resolution and mediation, landlord negotiation, and financial assistance. The goal of the policy is to ensure that y'all are implementing cost-effective human-centered services that expand capacity and return people to housing more quickly. Again, as Erica said, this really is an application that's intended to be for everyone. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. But the goal of this is ultimately to expand your system capacity with, as Erica said, something that many of you are already doing either yourselves or within your COCs. Homelessness prevention, street outreach, and emergency shelter will all be required to provide housing problem solving services. And what that looks like is going to depend on the project type. Rapid rehousing will be strongly encouraged to provide housing problem solving services, but that might not be the right fit for all COCs depending on where housing problem solving lives in their system. If it's situated with their shelter and outreach staff, if it's situated in their coordinated entry system, if it's considered a housing response on the permanent housing end, it really depends. Finally, housing problem solving should be implemented in coordination with other projects outside of ESG. And so we're talking not just COC program, but also other homeless services specific projects like the Department of Veterans Affairs SSVF program and the SAMHSA's, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration's PATH program, and even projects outside the homeless services lens, such as private funding, CDBG, which is a broader implementation, emergency housing voucher programs through PHAs, and anywhere else that in theory can fund these sort of flexible, primarily case management based activities. Next slide, please. So under homelessness prevention, the expectation is that the homeless prevention project type will use the prevention approach. In theory, it can also use the diversion approach, though that's usually better situated with street outreach and emergency shelter. For homelessness prevention, it really can be either one or multiple sessions, and all of them by definition are going to be in quick succession, right? Because homelessness prevention, we really expect it to be serving people who will, but for homelessness prevention assistance, experiencing literal homelessness within 14 days. And so you're really talking about you meet the person and you launch into housing problem solving activities, right? You do prevention on the spot and then you continue doing it until either it succeeds, which is obviously what you're looking for, but also you continue offering it until both you and the participant agree that it's not going to be a solution to what they're experiencing. And the goal really is to maintain permanent housing without financial assistance, if possible, or if you do need to provide financial assistance, that you aim for one-time financial assistance first, and short-term financial assistance, and really very short-term financial assistance, if as sort of a last resort. And what I would add to that is the thread running through all of this is progressive engagement, right? Erica touched on this. I'm going to hammer on it a little again. Progressive engagement fundamentally is the idea that you want to try and serve people with the lightest touch intervention possible. So somebody walks through the door and you know they're experiencing, or they say they're experiencing chronic homelessness, and they say they're living with a physical or behavioral disability. Your first response should not be, all right, let's get you PSH. Because the reality is that PSH first is a deeply limited resource, right? It's a precious resource. It's a very expensive intervention. You don't have a lot of it. It requires you to find an affordable housing unit in your community, which is always a barrier, but especially in California right now. And it's a long-term commitment. It goes on in an open-ended way. And so ideally what you want to do is intervene upstream with lighter touch and an escalating series of lighter touch interventions. You start with housing problem solving, you start with diversion, and if that doesn't work, you move on to rapid exit, which is like diversion but a deeper dive. And if that doesn't work, or rather if the case management and the negotiation parts of that don't work, then you move on to the very light touch financial assistance parts. And if that doesn't work, then maybe you talk about longer term financial assistance. But the point is that you start with the lighter touch stuff first, both because, number one, it's less expensive for y'all. At the end of the day, it is much less expensive to return someone to housing through a conversation than through ongoing rental assistance. But number two, in many cases, it is simply better for the participant to return to housing. From a human-centered perspective, it's just better to return to housing under your own steam than with a subsidy for a lot of different reasons. And they range from potential dependency created by receiving resources over the long term and resource cliffs, to the sense of being able to return to housing under your own steam and feeling reified in your own existence, to simply avoiding prolonged contact with the homeless services system, which no matter how well set up our local systems are, or no matter how well set up our implementations are, the experience of homelessness and contact with the systems of service are over time escalatingly traumatizing. And so we want to get folks back to housing as quickly as we possibly can. And this is the tool for doing that. So that was a lot on prevention. Thank you for letting me, I think Erica said camp on this slide. So let's go ahead and move to the next one. So housing problem solving under street outreach uses the diversion and rapid exit approach. Diversion is limited under street outreach, and it's arguably not even really true diversion. And the goal of it, when we talk about diversion through street outreach, is a one-session quick return to housing at first system contact. And when we're talking about street outreach, first system contact usually isn't on first night of experiencing literal homelessness. It's someone who's been experiencing literal homelessness maybe for a little while, maybe for kind of a long time, and they've finally decided to request services. But diversion at that point is a quick check-in, usually. It's a one-session deal most of the time to say, all right, let's go through and not assume that you've exhausted all of your support networks and personal resources, but let's instead assume that there is something out there that you can access with an outside lens and someone supporting you in doing that. And it'll work more often than you think. But that's what the diversion element of street outreach is. It's that quick hit that says, all right, you are maybe not spending your first night in a literal homeless situation or an unsheltered situation, but that's just fine. We're going to assume that you have a way to get back to housing absent outside intervention. So we're going to dig rapidly into what's available to you right now. If that doesn't work, street outreach really is more oriented around this rapid exit approach, which, like prevention, is one or multiple sessions. Unlike rapid, it's either in quick succession. If there seems to be a promising angle, you obviously want to follow that up quickly, but also it can occur, and often does occur, over a longer period of time, especially for folks who have been experiencing literal homelessness and unsheltered homelessness for a longer period of time. It can take a while to build the rapport that you need, as every street outreach worker on this call knows. It can take a long time to build the rapport that you need to get someone to trust you enough to start digging deep, but also to open up to you enough that you can help them navigate the resources that might be available to them, because there are emotional issues as well as circumstantial issues, right? You're navigating both the imminent trauma of unsheltered homelessness and the emotional impact of like engaging in the vulnerability necessary for this work. And you have to get through all of that before you can get to rapid exit really succeeding for most participants. Sometimes it just works, and that's awesome, but that's not the body of the work, right? The goal for housing problem solving under street outreach is a return to safe and stable permanent housing without financial assistance, or if financial assistance is needed, one-time assistance or very short-term. Do note that there will be slides later in this presentation that describe eligible costs. Obviously, street outreach cannot fund rental assistance over long term. Street outreach and shelter can't fund rental assistance. And so if you're returning someone to housing via housing problem solving, and you're relying on any form of rental assistance, you're going to be marrying that up with another project type, or you're going to be looking to flex funds for that. The note here at the bottom is ultimately that the goal is a return to housing without worrying about whether the participant goes through shelter first. And this is a big unlearning process for a lot of providers and a lot of COCs. And that's fine. It's where we all kind of are, right? Housing problem solving, while it's something that we've all been doing in some shape or another for a long time, and I think the more we dig into our COC's pattern of services, the more we discover that housing problem solving is just a new way of labeling, categorizing, and systematizing practices that we've all known all along work. The goal, though, is reorienting around this idea that housing problem solving is an exit from housing. It's a valid exit from housing, and it's often as or more effective than just landing somebody with a subsidy. And one of the things that you need to untangle, excuse me, fall in Louisiana. One of the things that you need to untangle in many systems is this idea that there's a really specific like success structure that exists for people experiencing homelessness. That first they experience unsheltered homelessness, or they're lucky and they go to shelter. But if they're experiencing unsheltered homelessness, eventually you get them to say yes to shelter. You find a bed that's open, that's willing to take them, that's able to take them. And so you transition from unsheltered homelessness to sheltered homelessness. And then from sheltered homelessness, you go into usually rapid rehousing, or you might go straight to PSH. But if you go into rapid, probably you're going to need to go into PSH if you qualify for chronic homelessness, or you exit from rapid into a housing choice voucher from your PHA. But there's this really clear paint by numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 step of unsheltered homelessness, sheltered homelessness, rapid rehousing, and then some form of longer duration subsidy. And it's unrealistic for a lot of different reasons. There isn't enough shelter. There isn't enough permanent supportive housing. There isn't enough rapid rehousing. There isn't enough affordable housing. There aren't enough housing choice vouchers. That doesn't work if that's your only model for getting out of homelessness, right? If that is your housing model, from homelessness back to housing, it's not going to be successful for many of the people in your community, number one. But number two, there's absolutely no reason that a person cannot at any point in that process return from the process to housing. There's no reason a person could not go from an unsheltered location straight back to permanent housing under their own steam, or with a rapid rehousing voucher, or a permanent supportive housing voucher, or a housing choice voucher. There's no reason you can't do that. Shelter is not a prerequisite to housing. You can get somebody document ready in the field. You can do housing problem solving in the field. You don't need a quiet office space in a community action agency's building that's set aside for housing problem solving to do it. Housing problem solving should meet people where they are at, right? It should meet people where they are. That's often going to be in the field. It's going to be in places that are not necessarily comfortable. It's going to be in places that are not necessarily like, we're going to sit on a park bench and do this on a warm day in July. It could be uncomfortable. It could be not as private as you would necessarily like, but it can be very effective when deployed in these settings because first, it's where people are. You are literally meeting them where they are. And so while your discomfort as an outreach worker might be present, your participant may be more comfortable there than they would be in that sort of air-conditioned private community action office setting that I just described. And I'm picking on community action agencies because I used to work for one and I know what that setting looks like. But the other part of that is that housing problem solving should be ongoing. And so street outreach, even when it does affect an entry into shelter, housing problem solving ought to continue because as much as a person can return to housing without a subsidy from an unsheltered location, they can do it from a sheltered location. Next slide, please. Sorry, I know that was out of nowhere. One of the challenges when talking about housing problem solving and trying to divide it into these neat little buckets is that housing problem solving is one thing that sort of self-divides into 3 approaches that divides into like 10 different techniques, but it's all kind of the same thing, which is about eliciting in participants the strength and support networks necessary to return to housing under their own steam. That's the ballgame. And so there's these artificial divisions that we're harping on, but they are artificial and they do kind of flow into each other. So housing problem solving under emergency shelter, just like street outreach, it uses the diversion and rapid exit approaches. I'm not going to camp on this slide. All I'm going to say here is housing problem solving for street outreach and emergency shelter are identical. They are doing exactly the same thing. The only difference is that diversion for street outreach is always focused around, this is your first system contact. We don't know how long you've been experiencing homelessness. We're just going to go from where you're at. For shelter, that situation absolutely occurs. But the other situation that is novel for shelters is that you do often get people, or you do often might be overstating it, but you do get folks showing up at shelter saying, I don't know where I'm going to sleep tonight. This is my first night in which that is occurring. What do I do? And at that point, you're engaging in a quick hit to say, we really want you to not enter shelter. We want you instead to go back to housing, either to where you were housed before or to safe, stable housing with someone else or somewhere else. And so we're going to work with you before you spend your first night in shelter to go somewhere else that is safer, more stable, more permanent, and that is actual. Accidentally muted myself, gesturing with passion about housing problem solving. So that's the one little quirk of emergency shelter. Next slide, please. Finally, rapid rehousing can provide housing problem solving under the rapid exit approach. It is not going to be required under any policy that you see, but it probably will be strongly recommended. Rapid exit, as we said, is this sort of one or multiple session deeper dive into getting somebody back to housing without a subsidy, or if you do have a subsidy, it's going to be short term rather than long term. Again, rapid rehousing can be part of a progressive engagement approach. And this is really about what I want to highlight here is that rapid exit or housing problem solving under rapid rehousing requires a reconceptualization of what rapid rehousing is. I think when rapid rehousing came out, a lot of communities, certainly the one I was working in at the time, which was about as far from California as you can get while staying in the United States without walking into the ocean. When rapid rehousing sort of first came around as a significant model of implementation, I think a lot of communities picked it up and said, cool. So the idea with rapid rehousing is we provide a year of rental assistance and case management with the option to extend to 2 years. And that was a really unfortunate default setting because rapid rehousing, especially under ESG, doesn't have to do that. Rapid rehousing under ESG, you can have an entire project that is just delivering housing problem solving with rapid rehousing. You refer somebody to rapid rehousing, and your whole project is just doing rapid exit work. You know, we are this project. We're not engaged in the business of distributing subsidies. We're engaged in the business of deeply engaging with you to determine whether you have a route back to housing in your life. And that's what we're going to do. We're going to meet every day. We're going to meet twice a day if we have to. We're going to find out if there is anybody in your life who could say yes to re-providing housing to you, or if you have the strength or resources to do it on your own, these strengths or resources to do it on your own. Or you can do a rapid rehousing project that applies a mixed approach that says, we're going to do rapid exit when you first get referred. And then if that doesn't work, we're going to start identifying short-term barriers and eliminate those. And we'll go back to rapid exit. And if that doesn't work, then we'll talk about 3 months of rental assistance and we'll keep doing the rapid exit thing. And the goal is ultimately, as I said earlier, to gradually increase the level of assistance until you reach whatever threshold is necessary for somebody to return to housing without the rapid rehousing. You know, we're going to give you 12 months and then option to extend to 24. The important thing I'd say about this is that rapid rehousing doing this is novel, right? It is a leading edge practice, I would say. And there's not a lot of rapid rehousing projects that are doing this. There's not a lot of rapid rehousing projects that have it integrated into their workflow. But the important thing that I would highlight is that there are COCs that have a really well integrated housing problem solving approach in their coordinated entry system that lives with street outreach and emergency shelter. And if you're already doing rapid exit with street outreach and emergency shelter, it might not make sense to do it in rapid rehousing also. Conversely, if your street outreach and if your street outreach and shelter aren't really set up to do it and aren't really set up to sort of change toward that, it might make sense now or in the long term to park rapid exit and housing problem solving activities with your rapid rehousing programs. That might make a lot of sense. It really depends on how your COC is set up. Next slide, please. So cost eligibility under ESG, this is a crosswalk of common housing problem solving expenses. This list is not intended to be all inclusive and it's not intended to exclude costs. This is just intended to highlight the things you're most likely to want to use HPS for and to give you sort of a starting point for we know this is good to go. It's not intended to say other things aren't, but this is where you would start. This list was drawn from a COVID-19 system response publication about using COC and ESG funds to fund these activities. This list was just, I mean, this chart came right out of the thing, but the publication is great. We've got some links to that at the end. I'm not going to linger here and list all of this stuff off, but please do reference back to this this in the next slide and the link at the end of this presentation about ESG cost eligibility for housing problem solving under all of the different participant facing project types. Next slide. Just going to linger here for a second. The only thing I'd highlight is you're going to see a lot of eligibility under rapid rehousing and homelessness prevention. That's fundamentally because they can do short-term assistance and all of the bells and whistles that come along with that. Shelter and street outreach have a more limited time of things to some extent because they are fundamentally not doing those rental assistance and longer duration subsidy things. Next slide, please. So training for housing problem solving is always a question. ESG can fund HPS training. They do need to fund it using admin or using cash match, or I suppose in-kind match under administrative costs. When we're talking about training, we're talking about what I think of as formal training. We're talking about training. But housing problem solving learning does often occur in a peer learning or collaborative setting, like during case conferencing, for example. And so that mode of learning, which is not training, can be funded under ESG's various case management eligible activities. All 4 of the participant-facing ESG components can fund those activities because fundamentally it's case management, right? You just happen to be learning along the way. There are additional resources from HUD and the United States Interagency Council on Homelessness, or USICH, resources in terms of documentation on how to do this, not in terms of money, to explain how to train folks, also training resources. So there's a couple of really good videos on it out there, as well as written materials, and those are you can expect to see those integrated into the policy. Next slide, please. So key activities, I'm just going to breeze past this because I think Erica really hit them hard. Really helping people assess their strengths and support networks, identifying potential routes back to housing that might not be obvious to folks and that don't require an ongoing subsidy, negotiating and assisting the participant in negotiating with critical folks in their lives, like landlords, family, and friends, and assembling a one-time or short-term financial assistance package using available resources, which includes but is not necessarily limited to ESG, to knock down financial barriers and return folks to housing. Next slide, please. Again, some examples of that: case management, conflict resolution, housing search, landlord-tenant mediation, connecting folks to mainstream benefits and resources, family mediation, tenant legal services, and credit repair. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to blow through all of these. These are financial assistance oriented things. All I would say about this is that you can provide financial assistance under housing problem solving. There's nothing wrong with doing that, but you should really try and tie it to an active barrier, and think about it in terms of an if-then statement. If I provide a security deposit, then this participant will return to permanent housing without an ongoing subsidy. If this barrier goes away, then permanent housing is achieved. And if you're instead looking at it from like, well, there's like 6 things going on here, and if we start knocking these down, there might be a return to housing, you know, you've kind of moved outside of housing problem solving and into longer term case management, and you're kind of doing rapid rehousing, and you're outside the framework of a quick return to housing is ultimately kind of what I'm saying there. So next slide, please. All right, I think that takes us into the Q&A portion. So if we have questions for me or Erica, I'm sure both of us would love to hear them and cover them. I know there have been some in the chat. Looks like we've got coverage on those, but we're here to answer. I always get a little nervous when we ask for questions and nobody says anything, because I know that I didn't do the best job presenting the material that has ever been done on this planet of Earth, which means that somebody out there has a question that they're not asking, and I would love to hear it. You're very welcome, Taylor. Not a question so much as a thank you, though.
Maybe you did do a lot better than you think you did.
Oh, I think I did great. I'm just saying I didn't do the best on the planet, and Erica did the same thing. This was a great presentation. I have a question for Erica, if Erica would take a consultant question. So Erica, I would be interested to know, what was the, if you can dig deep on this one, what was the most unusual successful housing problem solving implementation you've ever seen? Like a participant case that was solved in an unusual way using housing problem solving that our folks listening might not have expected.
Oh, Gordon, that's hard. I think, well, the first one that comes to mind is the one that I shared when I was talking about the bicycle. Just like hearing like that alone, like helping someone find a bike off of Craigslist was able to resolve their housing crisis. I think though, when you were talking about street outreach, that really got me remembering, and I've shared this story before when it's in shared housing, but we were working with 4 different veterans who were living together in a smaller encampment, and they were really happy living with one another. And so we were able to say like, hey, if we can find you a place where the 4 of you can live together, would you be willing to move there? And they were like, yeah, let's do it. And that alone was what solved like their housing crisis. We were able to find a 4-bedroom at that point in San Diego. It was fairly affordable for them, like to be able to split the rent. We got them enrolled in a program, and I think just like asking that question a little differently because we knew that they cared for each other solved it. So not sure if that's exactly what you're looking for, Gordon, but that's what I'm throwing your way.
No, that was amazing. I appreciate that. I had a similar situation. This is utterly not rapid related or HPS related, but I will share that the very best. So I used to run a shelter plus care program a million years ago in the Jurassic period. And we had 100 and some odd people at any given time, and we were in and out. And utterly the healthiest PSH implementation I have ever seen in terms of the health of the participant was thriving. Was a situation where a local realtor had bought like a turn of the century mansion, and it had like 8 or 9 bedrooms. And she used one bedroom as her office, and she lived in one of the bedrooms, and 7 of the bedrooms were reserved as 1-bedroom shared housing for people with a voucher from any of a variety of programs. And so we had like 3 PSH folks, and I think we had some HCV folks in there. It was a shared roommate situation, and it was a found family. I saw that I met with that participant 4 times, once a year, to re-inspect and just check in. And this was the only participant in the entire program who every time I checked in was like, yep, I'm good. Everything is great here. Everything is wonderful. Shared housing rocks. So not at all a housing problem solving thing, but I would highlight again that shared housing absolutely can be one of those routes. I think the other anecdote I would share is that housing problem solving can take a long time. Many of you may have heard this story before, but in another community that I worked with, sort of my very first homeless services community, it took 77. It took 77 outreach attempts to get someone to start saying yes to housing problem solving over a period of several years. And this was in a very, very cold place. And it was like every year you check in and say, Mr. X, how you doing? Ready for services? And he would say no, and say, okay, we'll talk in 3 months. 77 tries, but it finally worked. So
that's a lot of persistence. That makes me think of, there was an outreach story too here that there was an individual who'd been homeless on the streets, was considered chronically homeless years and years. I don't know how many attempts it was, but it was quite a few. And the thing that got this gentleman into housing was every night there was a program on TV that he wanted to be able to watch, and he couldn't consistently watch it on the street because he couldn't necessarily always find a spot to do that. And that was the outreach worker was able to say, like, what if we got you your own TV in your own home? Then you could watch this when you wanted. And that like moved the needle from the conversation. Because it's just like, what do people value and what do they care about? And how can we help them recognize, like find different avenues to be able to achieve that?
I love it. I love housing problem solving. I love all of this. Anyway, we are at wrap, so I'm going to kick this back over to, I think, LaQuantia.
Yes. Thank you, Erica, and thank you, Gordon, for this session on housing problem solving. And thanks to everyone for your questions throughout the presentation. Please note that a quick survey will pop up at the end of this session. So if you could take a moment to reply, we'd greatly appreciate it. And thank you for joining us, and look for the follow-up materials within the next day or two. See you next time.